Hi, I'm Nazo, and I have a type, a game I just can't resist playing. And those are choice-driven adventure games. Specifically, sad choice-driven adventure games. Ones that are basically playable indie movies, with the soundtracks to match. I play a lot of these games, and as I was playing 4 of them, these 4, I noticed that they were pretty similar. All 4 of them are coming-of-age stories. All 4 of them are choice-driven adventure games. All 4 of them have a heavy mystery element, but mostly focus on characters. I kind of wanted to make a video about how they were similar. And I did that. You're watching that video now. We're going to be going over all 4 games in painful, agonizing detail. What's good about them? What's bad about them? What's sexy about them? The works. Hopefully you'll like it. I really didn't know how to start this video, so there you go. The release of Telltale's The Walking Dead not only managed to resurrect a dead genre, albeit one that's still kind of dead, but it also changed how adventure games worked forever. Previously, games in the genre focused on puzzles. That's still the case, but the specific focus has shifted from physical puzzles to social puzzles, where the player has to gauge the consequences of their actions and how those actions will affect the characters around you. Characters who are, hopefully, likable enough to make those choices difficult. It usually doesn't end up being that complex or interesting, but it's a great idea, and it's one that's easy to develop a game around. Look at Telltale's massive library. And look at Life is Strange. Life is Strange couldn't exist without The Walking Dead or Telltale. It couldn't exist in a vacuum. None of the games in this video could. But of all the games in this video, Life is Strange is the most financially successful. Life is Strange honestly came out of nowhere to become a surprise hit, performing far better than it really deserved to. Developed by Dontnod, a French developer previously only known for a mediocre action game, Life is Strange put Dontnod on the map as a legitimate developer and inspired a legion of dedicated fans. It was successful enough to receive a prequel miniseries earlier this year. To its credit, Life is Strange remains a good game, and a unique one, the one that hasn't aged particularly well. Still, there's enough good here that it's worth experiencing, at least once. Telltale excels at telling human stories. Stories about down-to-earth people in relatable situations. However, even their most human stories are placed in highly fantastical settings, with highly fantastical problems, a side effect of their catalog mostly consisting of adaptations. Life is Strange immediately distinguishes itself from its forebears by placing its characters in an actual real-life setting. The town of Arcadia Bay isn't real, but you could see it being real. Dontnod took great care developing Arcadia Bay as a place with its own history, not just a set for the game's story. It also deliberately skews toward the obscure in terms of tone, taking inspiration from the David Lynch TV show Twin Peaks and the French graphic novel Blue is the Warmest Color. Although it's become more common over the years, most games still don't have this kind of setting, a sleepy small town with a lot of secrets and a lot of people hurt by those secrets, a place where it feels like everything is just seconds away from falling apart economically. This, I think, is part of why the game appeals to so many people, myself included. Part of the reason I bought into the game immediately when it was released was because there weren't really any other games like it in terms of tone or setting. And to this day, there still aren't really any games that capture the same feeling, besides Night in the Woods, but that was still 3 years away from being released. Since Life is Strange is an episodic series mimicking the Telltale approach, it makes sense to go over each episode individually, starting with Episode 1, Chrysalis. In game development terms, there's something called a vertical slice. Basically, it's a level or area made early in development as a kind of proof of concept for the game, a representation of all the systems and ideas of the game working together in one area, a microcosm of the finished product. Episode 1 of Life is Strange is its vertical slice, showing off its best and worst qualities all at once. In other words, it's a good first episode. Starting with the good, there's Chloe, who without a doubt is the game's best character. Despite not being the player character, she could easily be called the protagonist of the game, which is probably why the recently released prequel, Before the Storm, made her the player character. She's a great character. Not personality-wise, because Chloe is a horrible, selfish person who is constantly getting in trouble and committing petty crimes, but from a narrative perspective, she's layered and interesting. She has a lot of rage, and makes a lot of easily avoidable, stupid decisions, but it all comes from a reasonable place. The sudden death of her father and a disintegration of her family life thereafter. A situation only made worse by her stepdad, David Madison, a war veteran who is trying to do the right thing, but is doing it in the worst way possible. She didn't even have her best friend, Max Caulfield, your character, to rely on, because right after Chloe's father died, Max and her family left for Seattle, and Max never bothered to contact her again. That changes in Episode 1 when Max saves Chloe's life with her brand new time travel powers. I'm not going to go into too much detail about Max's powers, since, well, the game doesn't really go into that much detail itself, which proves to be a problem later on. As much as the game is about Max and Chloe's friendship, it's also about how this friendship grows Chloe as a person. She becomes less selfish and more understanding as the season goes on, to the point where she makes the ultimate sacrifice, something the Chloe from episode 1 would never do. She's really the only character in the game with a real honest-to-God character arc, and seeing the end of that arc, and the way that arc ends, is extremely satisfying. Of course, the reason this is notable is because I'd say she's the only truly good character. The game's other characters, up to and including Max, feel comparatively shallow. Often, the ideas behind them are better than the characters themselves. Take the secondary antagonist of the game, Nathan Prescott. He sounds like a great character on paper. On the surface, he's a generic rich kid, "you can't touch me, I have money" bully. But in reality, he's a deeply disturbed young man who would probably be a good person if his parents gave a crap about his mental health. For the most part, though, Nathan spends his screen time as the generic rich kid bully and nothing else. His more interesting aspects are only hinted at in the background for the most part, and are only really used in episode 5, about 2 hours before the game is over. Then there are characters like Victoria, the bully with a soft side, that are just flat-out cliches with nothing else to really make them unique. Even David, one of the better characters, comes off as only skin-deep, and also a bit inconsistent in terms of characterization. There's a part in episode 3 where David becomes weirdly sexist for about 4 minutes, and then it's never brought up again. What saves the writing, and the characters, is the character relationships. Warren being the generic quirky geek friend isn't all that interesting on its own, but his friend's own crush on Max, while equally as generic, is interestingly done. It's not as simple as it may appear, because Warren, while he means well, can be really creepy at times. There's a part in episode 2 where you can spot Warren hiding in the bushes, looking through Max's dorm room window. The same could be said about Victoria's relationship with Max, and a relationship with the wider art world. David's extremely complicated and messy relationship with his new family is far more interesting than David Madison the person. And of course, there's the ever-evolving relationship between Max and Chloe, which the game spends the majority of its runtime on. It's the complex and interweaving way that the inhabitants of Arcadia Bay all connect together that allows one to get past how paper-thin the majority of the characters actually are. Even by game standards, Life is Strange has a lot of concurrent side plots going on at once, that you can either indulge in by examining your surroundings or just choose to ignore. The fact that these side plots are remembered and carried through from episode to episode gives the season a strong sense of continuity, and makes the town seem a bit more lively than it actually is. Back to episode 1 itself, nothing much actually happens in it besides some rudimentary introduction to the characters and the main mystery of the game. Max and Chloe's search for Chloe's friend, a girl named Rachel Amber. Oh, and a tornado is going to destroy Arcadia Bay at some point, but that doesn't really get resolved until 4 episodes from now. You probably won't notice or care as the mystery is ignored for the most part, when you're instead swept up in Chloe's family drama for the rest of the episode. You will probably notice the dialogue, though, which ranges from decent to utterly bizarre at times, which is somewhat understandable considering that the writers are 30-year-old French dudes trying to write dialogue for 18-year-old American high school girls. The dialogue is a major issue, and probably Life is Strange's biggest narrative flaw, one that becomes more pronounced as we make our way through the other games in this video. That being said, it's not as bad as it could be, and that's mostly thanks to the voice acting. Voice acting is an underappreciated art. So underappreciated that a lot of voice actors, including Chloe's actor, Ashley Birch, went on strike for about 340 days in order to get better pay and benefits. The basic truth is that you can write the best dang dialogue in the entire world, and if it's voice acted poorly, the whole scene is going to be crap.
Darn that sound wave.
On the flip side, great voice acting can almost make bad dialogue sound good.
Max? Frank is really dead. I know.
I really have to hand it to Birch and the other actors. They do what they can with a frankly awkward script and make it believable. It doesn't work for every line, but you can always tell that the voice actors are trying. To many, these actors are these characters, to the point where several fans raised a stink when Birch wasn't brought back to reprise her role in Before the Storm. It was somewhat of an unfair criticism, considering the strike was going on when the game was made, but there was some value to it. If we're being honest, Ashley Birch made Chloe as much as Dontnod did. Episode 2 is the strongest episode of the season bar none, and features the best dialogue of the season, less wooden, more natural. It also features a distinct lack of focus on the mysteries of the game, instead making the choice to focus almost exclusively on the characters and their relationships. The plot may slow down here, but the character building is well done, and this is only the second episode of the season, so some leeway can be given in terms of plot progression. The train track scene, in particular, is a highlight, having a good balance of action, suspense, and nostalgia to character building to make it a defining scene for the entire season. Night in the Woods would later do a similar scene, and it's arguably a better scene there, but doesn't do it like Life is Strange. Episode 2, however, also holds one of the weakest moments of the season, the bottle sequence. On average, the weakest moments of the season are the ones where you're in full control of Max, usually when you're expected to solve some kind of puzzle. Max is sluggish, and moves slowly even when holding down the run button. This isn't a problem for the exploratory sections, but becomes tedious for puzzle sections, where you'll often have to retread the same area multiple times for several minutes, looking for just what you need to get to the next story scene. It should also be said that these puzzles are just bad. They aren't challenging or interesting, they're just slow and annoying, and the bottle sequence is the worst of these, being utterly pointless in the grand scheme of things and taking far too long to actually finish. It's so bad that not only was a better hint system for the puzzle patched in later, the final episode ruthlessly mocks this sequence, and this mocking is well deserved. Sadly though, the bottle sequence isn't self-contained. It repeats in different forms over the various episodes, and each time becomes even less enjoyable. Somehow. Still, a weak puzzle section doesn't distract from the ending of Episode 2, which is the strongest ending of all the episodes, Episode 5 included. Kate Marsh, after being bullied maliciously over a viral video, goes up to the roof of the girls' dorm and threatens to kill herself. Max is able to use her time powers to get up to the roof in time, but they conveniently short out just in time for Max to be forced to make a decision she can't come back from. Beyond the developers having to remove Max's time travel powers for it to work, it's a legitimately impactful scene, especially if you fail. Saving Kate shows a clever bit of game design as well. It's a dialogue challenge that requires the player to have personal knowledge of Kate, and is also reliant on previous altruistic actions from this episode and the last. In a way, the game is asking how much you care. Do you care enough about Kate to erase the mean messages on the board outside her room? Or the link to her video on the bathroom mirror? Do you care enough about Kate as a person to find out which family member hasn't abandoned her? How much do you care about Kate Marsh? It's clever. Probably the most clever the game ever is. Episode 3 is the low point of the season. That's actually putting it mildly. Episode 3 is kind of flat out terrible. The dialogue is at its worst here, not even the voice actors can make it sound natural this time. What's worse is that Episode 3, like 2, stalls plot progression in order to focus in on the characters' relationships. Again. Which is fine, the scenes with Chloe and Max are decent, but we're halfway through the series now and the mystery hasn't moved forward much, if at all. There are pieces of the plot scattered throughout Episode 3, and in the end, these pieces do form the main structure of the mystery, thus making Episode 3 an important episode. But these pieces of plot are presented with so little fanfare or creativity that I've forgotten most of them. There's some details about Frank the local drug dealer and Rachel being a couple. David could get kicked out of the house. That's about all I remember. The ending is also extremely weak. While writing this, I legitimately kept forgetting how Episode 3 ends. What happens is that Max gains some kind of Deus Ex Machina photo time travel power, again, unexplained, allowing her to go even further back in time than usual. Using this, she saves Chloe's dad. It's a scene that's semi-interesting, if only to see what Chloe's dad was like. Max returns to the new present to find Chloe in a wheelchair. Roll credits. It's a good cliffhanger, but there isn't much else. The ending of Episode 3 fails, because it really only serves to set up Episode 4. Luckily, Episode 4 is a fantastic intro, though one that squanders its full potential. I've always been a fan of stories where the characters end up going to an alternate timeline where things are different, and you get to see how and why things have changed. Bonus points if familiar characters are now acting completely out of character. You get a bit of that in Episode 4, but only in the opening act, and it's mostly restricted to Chloe and her family. There is a much wider timeline shift. You can figure this out by reading Max's journal and texts, which show a far different reality from the one we're accustomed to. But it's just the journal and texts. If Episode 4 had focused more on this new timeline, it could have taken Episode 2's place as the best episode. But it doesn't. For what it's worth, however, your time in this alternate world has an extremely strong ending, when alternate timeline Chloe makes a convincing argument to help her commit assisted suicide. It convinced me, anyway. Regardless of what you do, you go back in time again, and this time let Chloe's dad die, thus allowing you to return to the main timeline. From there, it's a scavenger hunt to acquire clues pertaining to the game's three main villains: David, Nathan, and Frank. David's hunt is fine, nothing special. Meanwhile, Nathan's is about as cringeworthy and one-note as a character. But Frank's is a marvel. Your conversation with him feels natural, truly human, no awkwardness about it. It helps that there are a fair number of ways the situation can end, from Frank's death to him being injured to him giving you his client list peacefully. Like Kate's suicide, it's a dialogue puzzle, and a much more difficult one since unlike Kate, the dialogue options you have to choose aren't as obvious. They aren't random though, because like Kate's scene, they require knowledge of who Frank is. How much do you care about Frank Bowers? The weight of this scene gets reduced somewhat by the fact that you could just rewind over and over until Frank gives you the list, but it remains a highlight for the episode and the season. It's also when episode 4 takes a sharp downturn in quality. Following one of the few genuinely interesting non-dialogue puzzles in the game, you explore a barn where Nathan bought drugs, which also holds one of the less obnoxious versions of the bottle sequence. There you discover the Dark Room, a photography rape dungeon where girls are drugged and then photos are taken of them in their drug state by Nathan. It's an interesting idea, but one the game doesn't really take advantage of. Like the game's characters, the Dark Room is more interesting in idea than execution. Kate Marsh was taken to the Dark Room. So was Rachel Amber. The twist is that Rachel is dead. She's always been dead, from the moment you started the game. It's a neat twist, and the scene is carried by a good song choice and Chloe's voice acting. But it does show how thin the mystery of the game really is. All along, the game has essentially been building up to the statement, Rachel is dead, for 4 episodes of this 5-episode season. After that is a rather boring slog through a Vortex Club party trying to warn Victoria, the next victim. Victoria is yet another dialogue puzzle, but a much simpler one, even compared to Kate. Beyond that, the party sequence accomplishes nothing. Thankfully, episode 4 ends on one last twist, and it's a good one. Chloe is killed, for like the 4th time at this point, and the true villain is revealed. As it turns out, it was not David, or Frank, not even Nathan Prescott. It was Max's photography teacher, Mr. Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson as a villain is an interesting decision, but ultimately, his foreshadowing as a villain works better than him as a villain. There is foreshadowing to this twist, quite a bit of it, and it's the good kind, the kind that recontextualizes previous actions in a new light.
Seriously though, I could frame any one of you in a dark corner and capture you in a moment of desperation.
After the twist, however, Jefferson changes from a calm and collected teacher into a childish psychopath, which could have worked, but the writers go way overboard with it. He reminds me a lot of the Alan Wake villain, Mr. Scratch. He even, at one point, plays a song that goes something like, I'm crazy, just like Scratch. However, where Scratch and Alan Wake, the game, were self-aware about how ridiculous a villain and character Scratch was, Life is Strange plays it seriously, much to its detriment. He even spends close to around 10 minutes talking about his evil plan and every single detail of that plan if you ask. This is not helped by Jefferson's voice actor deciding to sound as evil as possible. He's a major focus for the episode, and this starts the episode off on a sour note. Thankfully, Jefferson is eventually removed from the plot, and it gets back to the other characters, and I mean it really gets back to them. It becomes clear here, in the final episode, that the devs aren't really interested in resolving mysteries. Not in a satisfactory way, at least. They never bother to even try and explain the whole time travel thing. At some point, a few characters even go, and I quote, "We may never know what really happened. Is this magic? Is this science? We just don't know, and we never will. Oh well." I wouldn't call it lazy writing, because as awkward and as corny as the dialogue can be, it can't be called lazy. Still, I would say it's a bad choice. The nightmare sequence is also a bad choice. I don't know why the nightmare sequence is even here. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it goes on for way too long for far too little payoff. It's very impressive visually, but narratively, it serves no purpose, and it feels like it was thrown in there just for the sake of being thrown in there so they could have a nightmare sequence. But they do make fun of the bottles, so I guess that's something. When that's finished, you have one last choice. You see, the tornado that is destroying Arcadia Bay is a result of Max saving Chloe all the way back in the first episode. Chaos theory, as Warren explains, even though that's not how chaos theory works at all, but whatever. You could sacrifice Chloe to save the town, or sacrifice the town and everything living in it to save Chloe. It's an obvious choice, an easy one. Even Chloe herself says that she has to die. But the game gives you the choice anyway. If you so choose, you can go against the themes of the game. You can throw all the character development for Max and Chloe out the window in one fell swoop. It's an interesting choice, even if it's the wrong one. There's a great video about just this topic by Media Obsession, and I suggest you check it out. Disregarding the quote-unquote bad ending, which is very cheap and very unfulfilling, the good ending has narrative issues all its own, since it retcons and diminishes the player's choices in a way it really didn't have to. However, the actual ending itself is well put together, and has a great song choice. The ending is inconsistent, which is what could be said about the rest of the game. Life is Strange has gloriously high highs and devastatingly low lows. Like I said at the beginning, it's worth experiencing, but depending on what you're willing to put up with to get to the game's high points, you may not want to play through it more than once. Especially since more than a few games have come out since Life is Strange that have taken the same themes and ideas and done a much better job with them. If Life is Strange takes its primary inspiration from Twin Peaks and obscure French comics, Oxenfree takes its inspiration from horror movies. More specifically, the kind of teen-centric, postmodern horror movies from the 90s like Scream. It even has the same kind of generic, easily avoidable setup those movies had. A couple of unsupervised teens go to a party on a suspicious island. Said island is home to a ghost. A ghost that you awaken. And things get freaky. Fast. Oxenfree differentiates itself from those movies and aligns itself with Life is Strange by not really giving a crap about the horror of the situation or the mechanics of said horror. Like all of these games, Oxenfree is a character-focused experience. All other aspects, narrative and gameplay-wise, are secondary. Though unlike Life is Strange, what gameplay there is in Oxenfree is more developed and enjoyable. Rather than keeping both halves separate, Oxenfree weaves its narrative and gameplay together to create a unique experience, one that manages to use the merging of the two elements to make up for their respective weaknesses, of which there are many. Oxenfree is probably best described as a walking simulator with extremely light exploration elements. It's hard to call Oxenfree a puzzle game, since it's really only one type of puzzle that gets repeated around 20 times. But the simplicity of that puzzle and the short time it takes to complete it keeps it from getting stale. The same could be said of the platforming and exploration of the game, which mostly consists of you pressing the directional buttons and occasionally pressing space to jump over a gap. It's simple, but just as simple as the game needs it to be. No more and no less. At times, however, it's too simple. The majority of the game is you going from place to place, just walking, only occasionally stopping to find some dialogue or collectible. When you take into account the character's very slow walking speed, this can get annoying, especially toward the end of the game when the characters don't have much left to say to each other, making the extended lengths of time you're out slowly walking around the game map boring. Thankfully, Alex, the main character of the game, is never alone in Oxenfree, and the characters never shut up, in a good way. Oxenfree is a much smaller game than Life is Strange, and has a smaller cast to boot. Oxenfree's characters fall into the typical kind of ensemble you'd find in a team drama. The developers have taken care to not make them too archetypal. They're still archetypes, but they feel like the kind of archetypes you find in the real world. The developers also make sure to add some kind of twist to each character. Jonas, my personal favorite character, is the straight man of the ensemble and one of the best voice acted. However, it's implied he has a criminal past. He has unresolved issues with his dead mother and is prone to his own bouts of lunacy at times. Ren is the confident deadpan snarker of the group, but he's also a druggie, and his recreational drug use ends up creating a rift. Clarissa, in particular, plays with character expectations and cliches in interesting ways. She's portrayed as the mean girl at the start, a better written version of Victoria. Victoria only got a slight bit of development over the course of Life is Strange, and it was an obvious path for her character to take, her becoming slightly nicer. Clarissa, however, is not a generic mean girl. She's actually rather nice to everyone but Alex, who she personally blames for the death of her boyfriend and Alex's brother Michael. As unfair, yes, but understandable, and resolvable. The only character really who comes off as flat is the main character, Alex. There is some interesting character building regarding her relationship to Michael and her understanding of Clarissa, but it mostly happens in the background. She remains fairly static through the experience, never really becoming more than the snarky main character. Her relationship with Jonas could have been interesting and the source of her development, but it feels one note, too simple. You become friends or enemies far too quickly. This isn't a fault with the writing so much as a fault of the game's dialogue system. The relationship between Jonas and Alex will always feel slightly artificial, because it is. Because the game is looking for flags to flip a switch as to whether Jonas and Alex like each other or not. This isn't a problem exclusive to Oxenfree, it's one shared by most games with dialogue trees, where relationships and whether someone hates you or not feel artificial due to the inherent limitations of branching dialogue. With the exception of Clarissa, who is almost never around, this is an issue all of the characters suffer from. There are issues unique to Oxenfree's dialogue system, however, and they're very big issues, on par with Life is Strange's dialogue writing. While his presentation is great, the idea of having the options themselves fade away was a bad one. Most games of this type, if they have timed dialogue, make the timer separate so that the player can still get an idea of what they're going to say. Here, you have to rush to read what every option says before they all disappear, and then quickly make a choice before the option is gone. This wasn't really a problem for me, but I'm also a fast reader, and I can definitely understand this being a major issue for some people. Then there's how Alex speaks. Like Telltale games and Firewatch, you technically interrupt characters when you speak. Whenever you speak. However, in those games, your response usually won't occur until the other person is done talking, or at least until there's a pause in their dialogue. In Oxenfree, Alex's responses are instantaneous and always cut off someone else. The dialogue goes so fast that there are no natural breaks in speaking to accommodate Alex. Eventually, I got used to it, but I couldn't help but feel that a lot of the time, Alex was talking over people rather than talking to people. Thankfully though, the dialogue system doesn't get in the way of the dialogue itself, which is Oxenfree's strongest asset. Oxenfree's characters are all well and good, but a character is only as good as how they talk. And Oxenfree's characters talk like real people, real teenagers. They sound like it do, thanks to some high-quality voice acting. They mispronounce words, often fill their sentences with likes, whatevers, and, etc. And they never stop snarking, which seems unrealistic, but I can tell you from my time hanging out with friends that it's very true to life. In other words, the exact opposite of Life is Strange's dialogue. Oxenfree overcomes the limitations of its simplistic gameplay by drowning out the monotony of those sections with a never-ending flood of words. And while the dialogue goes fast, very rarely is a word wasted. You're either learning something about your partner's personality, backstory about the island, or something else about the main story. You want to hear the characters talk more than you want to really do anything with them. A common idiom is show, don't tell, but Oxenfree makes a good case that sometimes telling is better than showing, at least if a character is doing the telling. When Oxenfree was still in development, studios were looking to make a movie based on the game. But I don't think an Oxenfree movie would be good, since 90% of Oxenfree is just characters walking through the woods and talking to each other. And it's a testament to the writing that this ends up being the game's hook, the reason for playing. With dialogue and character being the main focus, the supernatural and horror elements of the story fall into the background. Unlike in the other games, though, Oxenfree makes it clear that the mystery is not going to be a huge element of the story. In fact, the mystery is more or less solved in the first quarter of the game, which admittedly isn't saying too much considering the game's short length. As for the horror, Oxenfree forgoes actually scaring you and instead decides to spend the majority of its time just building tension, putting you at unease, messing with your head with visual glitches and mind-bending environments. Most of the time, it works. It makes the ghostly presence on the island feel truly alien, which is helped by the game's synth-heavy soundtrack. Other times, it's over the top, especially when the ghosts threaten the lives of your friends and then never does anything with them. There's no consequences for failing their games, and because of that, they feel hollow and overdone. This isn't helped by the fact that the ghosts and how they function is only cursorily explained in one of the easily missable letters scattered around the island. It's time we talk about Oxenfree's length. It's not long. None of the games here are. And while it may not be the shortest technically, it feels the shortest. Just because a game is short doesn't mean it's bad, but Oxenfree is a bit too short for its own good. Jonas is my favorite character in the game, but that's likely because he's the character you spend 99.9% of the game with. Ren, Clarissa, and Nona, who has so little impact on the story I didn't even bother to mention her until now, all get a paltry level of screen time compared to him. And if the game were even slightly longer, this could have been rectified. It also hurts the collectibles and pacing, since the collectibles that are plot relevant, the Adler letters, can really only be gained through backtracking. And by then, the vast majority of the game's dialogue has been worked through, forcing you to hunt for them in boring, frustrating silence. Then there are certain scenes near the end that are meant to be the conclusion of character arcs, but feel like they come out of nowhere. Like Ren's confession that he doesn't consider you his friend anymore due to your actions that night. Not only is it completely random, considering that only seconds before everyone was buddy-buddy and talking about Nona and Ren going on a date, but it's immediately forgotten about by everyone. The last hour or so of Oxenfree is full of these moments, non-sequiturs that are meant to conclude character arcs but feel hollow and forced. Luckily, the ending makes up for it. Oxenfree has, without a doubt, the strongest ending of any game in this video. It's concise, sticks to the game's themes, doesn't remove player agency, and has some neat little twist to it. The final conversation with the ghosts in particular is a highlight, as it becomes clear that this apparently unknowable being is really just kind of childish and scared. Also, if you want, you could just leave Clarissa to die and become the ghost puppet. Which seems like a pointlessly cruel choice, but if you haven't bothered to get to know Clarissa, it's a tempting one. She was a jerk anyway, why bother to save her? It's a more natural version of Kate's suicide. The game is asking you whether you care about Clarissa. In Life is Strange, saying no is objectively the wrong answer, but Oxenfree doesn't make it as black and white. All of the endings, and yes, there are multiple endings, are satisfying in their own way, and besides the one where you leave Clarissa to die, they could all be seen as good endings if the player so chooses. After a well-presented epilogue where Alex tells you the long-term consequences of your action, the game ends with one last twist, revealing that Alex, and maybe her friends, are stuck in a time loop. It feels a bit unfair, but it is creepy and effective. It's a great ending. If you aren't playing New Game Plus. There was New Game Plus content added to Oxenfree post-release, and I honestly wish I had more to say about it. It adds some new scenes and more dialogue, and most importantly, it allows you to end the time loop via a bonus scene tacked onto the vanilla epilogue. To be honest though, while they're nice touches, it's nothing revolutionary, and I think that the bonus ending after the fact is rather forced. Oxenfree didn't need to have a happy ending, and by doing so, a second playthrough ends on a weaker note than the first one. Oxenfree was a moderate success and a critical darling, and one of my favorite games from 2016. It may not have set the world on fire like Life is Strange, but it also set the bar for natural-sounding dialogue in these kind of games, a bar future Life is Strange games are going to have to try and live up to. Not long after Oxenfree, another game with a similar style of gameplay and writing would be released. A game that, for all its promise, and all the talent behind it, ends up being weaker than Oxenfree. At first glance, and maybe even second glance, Firewatch doesn't look like it belongs in this video with all these other games. Firewatch is first person as opposed to third person. It's a borderline Metroidvania with a strong focus on gameplay. It has a naturalistic feel and setting as opposed to the other three games' urban settings. Even Oxenfree, despite taking place on a deserted island, took place on a deserted island that was a popular tourist trap. Most glaring is that Firewatch isn't a coming-of-age story in the traditional sense. Whereas the main characters of the other games are either teenagers or just breaking into their 20s, the main characters of Firewatch are about 38 and 42 years old respectively. It's still a coming-of-age story, a coming-of-middle-age story. It has the themes and narrative to match that more mature and complicated idea. The ideas behind Firewatch are complex, but the gist of the game itself is not. In the words of Camposanto, the developers of Firewatch, quote, Firewatch is a story about a guy who works in a fire lookout tower and something strange and mysterious happens. That's it. I can guarantee, after playing through Firewatch twice, that the story really is that simple. It seems like the mystery is going to be a large part of the game from the outset, and the game's focus on the mystery ends up causing a lot of narrative problems down the road. More so than any of the four games, the mystery is unimportant in Firewatch. It's certainly a part of Firewatch, but this isn't the story about what happens in the woods. This is the story of Henry and Delilah, about their relationship, their troubles, and how they failed in their own ways. You find out how Henry failed at the beginning of the game, with a Twine-esque choose-your-own-adventure sequence that explains Henry's relationship to his wife Julia, and how that relationship slowly dissolves after Julia is diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at 46. This is why Henry came out into the woods, to escape from the problems he has back at home, the real world. As George Weidman, better known as Super Bunny Hop, points out, this introduction serves to set Henry and the player on the same page. There is no grand reveal about why Henry came to the forest, because Firewatch is more concerned about developing Henry as a character naturally than with a forced twist. It's an admirable goal. It's also redundant, since there's a scene near the beginning where Henry gives out his entire backstory anyway, which comes off repetitive, and the game could have just had the dialogue options the player chose in this sequence determine Henry's past rather than have an entirely separate sequence at the beginning. But that's the least of Firewatch's writing problems. Instead of an ensemble that plays off one another like Oxenfree, or a large interconnected cast like Life is Strange, Firewatch focuses exclusively on two characters, and in the process is able to make those characters richer and deeper in a way that Life is Strange and Oxenfree couldn't do. This is doubly impressive, considering that the only character you will ever see in the game is Henry. Everyone else is so far away you can only make out an outline. You don't even get to see what Delilah, your faithful friend and companion through the game, looks like. As in Oxenfree, a standout of Firewatch is its dialogue, but it's not good in the same way as Night in the Woods or Oxenfree. These are older characters, with older, somewhat unrealistic vocabularies, and that shows in their dialogue. Instead of snarky, off-the-wall thoughts and repeated ums and likes, the dialogue plays off more like a Joss Whedon script. A good Joss Whedon script. Henry and Delilah aren't real people. That's very clear in the way they talk. But they are good characters, and their back-and-forth dialogue with each other helps develop who they are and their relationship with one another. The writing in Firewatch is crisp, clear, and very similar in tone and cadence to The Walking Dead and other Telltale games. Which makes sense, since Sean Verneman, the lead writer of The Walking Dead Season 1, was also the lead writer of Firewatch. Just like in that game, characters and their personalities are introduced quickly, and the fine details of those personalities are given time to simmer and change as the game goes on. Campo Santo also takes some negative aspects from Telltale. All of these games promise choice and consequence. They promise that all of your choices have consequences. Naturally, this is false. However, Firewatch does the least with this. The most your choices will ever affect is 1 or 2 lines of dialogue, and that's about it. Oxenfree has several different permutations for endings depending on your choices. Night in the Woods has multiple paths, and even Life is Strange has several different sequences and dramatic changes to plot depending on your choices. Firewatch has none of that. There's a reason I don't like to play Telltale games more than once. It's because the games are at their strongest when you have an illusion of consequence to your choices. When the illusion is gone, the quality of the game suffers. This is true of Firewatch as well. Firewatch compensates for this by leaning into its systems and gameplay, which is, surprisingly, quite competent on its own. There's a much smaller dialogue per square foot ratio in Firewatch compared to the other games, but that's because Firewatch doesn't need to rely solely on its dialogue and story to carry the experience. Henry controls well, not too slow and not too fast. His animations when hiking through the wilderness are slow and deliberate enough to lend him some weight, and are fast enough as to not make traveling through the park a chore. And that's what you'll spend 90% of your time doing in Firewatch. Hiking. Like a real wilderness explorer. The game even encourages you to explore by hiding dozens of hidden areas that the game never leads you through during the story, and filling these areas with collectibles and small optional tidbits of story. These areas open up more and more as the game goes on, syncing up with the tools Henry acquires. With these tools, you're able to explore new areas of the map and open shortcuts to previous areas. It's not a huge map, or a particularly complicated one, but it is one that feels real and places plenty of rewards, big and small, for the player to discover if they take the time to really explore in their surroundings. Whereas Life is Strange and Oxenfree only begrudgingly acknowledge gameplay, Life is Strange especially, Firewatch embraces it and it has the best gameplay of the 4 games. There's a reason a sandbox mode with no story or mystery was added into the game later with a patch. But even with this mode, Firewatch is primarily a narrative adventure game. That was what it was developed to be, and it has to be judged as such. We've talked about the story's strengths, but we also have to talk about its flaws. And there are a lot of them. Firewatch mostly pushes the mystery into the background by the end in order to bring Delilah and Henry to the forefront, but also does this because the mystery is about as thin as a wet paper plate, and on top of that, wraps up in an extremely unsatisfying way. This is mitigated in the previous 2 games, because they balanced their mysteries with the character building. Life is Strange, despite having one too many filler episodes, was especially good at this. Firewatch is not. It's about 4 hours long, and about 3 of those hours are spent building up the mystery, the tension, building up to an inevitable release, which never comes. There are great character moments here, as Delilah and Henry slowly fall into a kind of paranoid insanity over what is happening in the park. There's a particularly great sequence in which Henry wonders if he's suffering from dementia like his wife. And he might be. And considering everything that's happened, considering how the game is constructed, the story of Firewatch may very well be Henry's weird Alzheimer's dream. But these character moments are mostly ignored for the sake of the mystery. There's also the issue on how the story actually fits together as a whole. On a first playthrough, the events of the story all serve to ratchet up the tension, and they still do on a second playthrough, but once you're aware of the twist, it becomes clear that the story is really one long chain of coincidences, each one less realistic than the last. This story can only happen if Henry goes a specific route on a specific day and encounters a specific person at a specific time. That's only at the beginning, but like with Life is Strange's bottle sequence, it just keeps happening. At one point, a plot-crucial item is just found in the woods, because according to the audio commentary, it was just bad luck that the people following Henry happened to drop this MacGuffin in this specific area. This isn't bad writing on its own. Rather, it's an attempt by the developers to keep the player in Henry's shoes. It's the same reason why you have the backstory section at the beginning. You and Henry are 100% on the same page, no hidden agendas or anything. You discover plot elements as Henry does, walking through the woods, slowly putting the pieces together. It's naturalistic storytelling for a naturalistic setting, and it mostly works. But there is a cutoff point where it starts to get a bit unrealistic that Henry just happens to run into an important piece of plot by wandering through the forest. Then there's the ending, which was cited by many reviewers and fans as the worst aspect of the game. And I agree. From a writing standpoint, it's the perfect ending though, and I understand why Campo Santo went with it. It is revealed early on in the game that Henry was not the first person to use the Firewatch tower you now inhabit. 3 years ago, a man named Ned Goodwin was in charge, and he had his son Brian with him. You're not supposed to bring kids to the Firewatch towers, but Ned had no one else to take care of Brian, so he brought Brian with him. Thought it would do the kid some good. Delilah knew about this, but told no one. She thought it was harmless. Ned and Brian couldn't be more different, though. Ned was a man's man, an army veteran, and seasoned outdoorsman. His son was a nerd who drew a fantasy map of the area and played a lawyer-friendly version of D&D. Ned kept pushing his son into going into the great outdoors. He pushed too hard, and Brian died in a climate accident. Something in Ned broke, and he decided to live in the forest, cut himself off from civilization, escape from his problems. Just like Henry and Delilah, though to a more extreme extent. The strange phenomena and conspiracy nonsense in the park was never real. It was all Ned. Trying in vain to keep Henry from investigating the cave you go through in the game's first level. The same cave that holds Brian's decaying body. There is no mystery. There never was, really. Henry and Delilah invented something that wasn't there out of boredom and isolation. They built up a grand conspiracy plot, and it turned out to be nothing. You don't even get to meet Ned. He's long gone by the time you find his lair. After that, Delilah leaves, even if you ask her to stay, and your stay is over. That's the moral of Firewatch. The point of Firewatch. You can't escape from your problems, not forever. You have to go back and deal with them. Otherwise, you end up like Ned, a sad, crazy hermit living in a hole in the middle of the woods. It's a perfect ending written down. It's the execution that ruins the whole thing. There's plenty of build-up in Firewatch, but none for the ending itself. On the final day of the game, the radar you picked up a few days earlier starts to go off. You follow it to a rope. And that's it. The game is basically over. What's happening is that the game is just kind of literally pointing you to the ending. It doesn't happen naturally like the rest of the plot. It happens because the developers either ran out of time, money, or ambition. There should have been one final climb, one final semi-epic event just to make the reveal of how pointless it was all the more crushing. That doesn't happen. What you get is a cassette tape on the side of a rock and a small room that conveniently holds all the exposition for making the plot work. Just one room. That's it. If you have any more questions, even ones that make sense, too bad. They're unimportant. And after that, all that's left is an overly long hike to Delilah's tower and a short conversation in Delilah's tower where Henry basically goes, "Yep, it's over, I guess. Oh well. Whatever." These final moments should be the height of the game, and yet they're so low-key and so devoid of substance that when I first played Firewatch, I honestly thought that I had missed something. I thought that the people in the helicopter were going to push Henry out in one final twist. I thought there was going to be something. That the game wasn't just going to end on a flatter note than zero. But it does. Which may or may not have been intentional. But regardless of whether or not it's intentional, it's not very good. If there's one thing I can say about the ending, is that it's much easier to take a second time through. When you know what's happening, you can focus on Firewatch more as the deconstruction it is, rather than the mystery it appears to be. It almost makes me wonder whether the game should have just done away with the mystery angle and been more about the relationship between Delilah and Henry. Campo Santo seems to think so, considering that their recently announced game, In the Valley of the Gods, has no mention of mystery or anything supernatural, focusing solely on the relationship between two people. And hopefully, Campo Santo will have learned from the narrative mistakes of Firewatch to make Valley of the Gods a more complete experience. I don't usually like to say that a bad ending ruins something, because the ending being bad doesn't inherently ruin everything that came before. Mass Effect 3, even with the extended cut, has one of the worst endings ever written, far worse than Firewatch, but that doesn't diminish the quality of the first two games, or even the preceding events in the third game. However, considering how short Firewatch is, and how high its base price of $20 is considering what you get here, I can't really recommend Firewatch. Not at full price. I'm also confident in saying that Firewatch is the weakest game in this video. But that's alright, because we're about to get into the strongest. Night in the Woods is the most recent of these games to be released, and it feels like a culmination of all three, a synthesis. It takes the setting and tone from Life is Strange, the dialogue of Oxenfree, and the more developed gameplay of Firewatch and combines them all into one package. It's a case of jack of all trades, master of none. The individual elements that make up Night in the Woods aren't as strong on their own as they are in other games. It's the combination of all these elements and how well these elements fit together that Night in the Woods finds its center and becomes a fully featured experience. The game all the others were trying to be. If Firewatch is the simple story of a guy in a fire lookout tower who deals with strange phenomena, Night in the Woods is an even simpler story. It's the story of May Borowski coming home. Or perhaps it's the story of her home, Possum Springs. While Night in the Woods does focus on May specifically, this is a story shared by the entire town. A story that's a familiar one in a post-economic crisis America. One where blue-collar, hard labor jobs are in short supply as the country moves towards outsourcing and digitization. In this era of American history, the Rust Belt, and the small industry-driven towns like Possum Springs that are within the Rust Belt, have been steadily losing relevance. The major industries, mining and factory work, have either dried up or been moved overseas. Mom-and-pop shops in the town are dying and being swallowed up by larger chains. When May comes home, the family-run grocery store The Food Donkey has been out of business for years, replaced by the sleek, modern, franchised Ham Panther. And the rest of the town is going through this as well, a period of change that may or may not be good for anyone. Possum Springs, as it was, is dying. There's a hole at the center of it, an economic hole that's growing larger by the minute and consuming all the opportunities in town. It's roughly the same kind of town as Arcadia Bay from Life is Strange, albeit with a different industry of focus. But most of Arcadia Bay's problems were told to the player, never shown, and this is something Night in the Woods improves upon as May makes her way past boarded-up buildings and explores once great industrial ruins. Your best hope is to get out, get a degree, and get a job somewhere that isn't here. May was close to that, but she ended up dropping out and coming home, which is exactly the opposite of what everyone wanted for her. Night in the Woods can be conveniently cut up into about 3 acts, each with their own tone and focus. The game is aware of this, since it itself splits the game into acts. The longest, by far, is the first. Act 1 has a very freewheeling nature to it. May's just gotten home, free of responsibilities, and immediately reconnects with her old friend Greg. They do crimes together. Not serious crimes, though. It's the kind of petty vandalism you would expect from a teenager like Chloe or Jonas. Not 20-year-olds May and Greg actually are. Act 1 doesn't have much direction because May doesn't have much direction. Instead of a concise plot, Act 1 consists of a series of vignettes. Some of them are large and fully featured, where May hangs out with her friends, usually playing through a unique minigame only found in that hangout. Most of these vignettes are found in the town itself, and this carries over to the other acts as well. Firewatch, and to a lesser extent Oxenfree and Life is Strange, encourage exploration by hiding side plots and side quests in out-of-the-way areas. However, these were all paper-thin, especially in Firewatch. They never really added anything substantial to the plot itself. They were more there for the sake of being, like Henry getting a hat or a pet turtle. The side content in Night in the Woods, however, is substantial, and to many is part of the draw of the game. Certain side quests can even affect the hangouts in small but impactful ways. Some of these side plots are superfluous, like the rats you can nurture through Act 1, but most either provide new gameplay opportunities or new story threads that weave in and out of May's own plot thematically. It helps that these stories are easily able to stand on their own, independent of the game's main plot. Take the Pastor Kate subplot. Kate is a new youth pastor in the town who wants to change things. She wants to help a nearby homeless man named Bruce by letting him stay in the church. It's not an unrealistic idea. After all, the town is full of empty space, perfect for that kind of thing. She tries, and hopes, and prays, and fails. Not that it matters. Bruce knows full well that Pastor Kate's plan will fail, so he leaves the day before a town council vote. He says he's going back to see his family, even though previous dialogue implied that his family was dead. As Bruce predicted, the vote doesn't go Kate's way, and she's left to figure out how to move forward. Meanwhile, Bruce's fate is left unresolved, and May is just kind of in the middle of all this. It's one of the strongest subplots in the game, and also one of the easiest to miss, since it's located in an obscure part of the town map. Every person in Possum Springs has a story if you look for it, even the truckers who just stand outside of the bar for the entire game. Interacting with this content is mechanically satisfying as well. Although it's never really used to its full potential, Night in the Woods actually has very solid platforming gameplay. There's even a skill-based mechanic where May can get a high jump after 2 successive jumps. It feels great to use, even if the game never really forces you to use it outside of the opening area. To access most of the side content though, which is conveniently stashed on roofs, you will have to do some light platforming, and you'll have fun doing it. The game also wisely includes a large number of minigames that gamify what would otherwise be scripted interactions, such as some bathroom vandalism or stealing from an off-brand Hot Topic. They're never very complicated, most just have you moving May's hand and then pressing the square button, but they come up at just the right points to break up the inherent monotony of the game. Because as good as the writing and gameplay is, Night in the Woods at times can't escape the fact that you're essentially doing the same thing over and over again for 2 weeks of in-game time, a fact that grows more noticeable as the first act goes on. Since Act 1 is dominated by vignettes, the writing can feel overstuffed at times, like it's a bundle of stories with no particular thread for you to follow outside of May waking up and jumping through town every day. This is mitigated somewhat by most of these threads being interesting, but this problem isn't really resolved until the end of Act 1, which is about halfway through the game. That's a long time to wait for an inciting incident. Even Life is Strange, for as much time as it wasted, sets up its mystery, and thus the plot, in its first episode. Here, you only get the inciting incident after half a game's worth of plot has gone by. But on the flip side, this means that by the time the plot starts, you're well aware of the main characters and the issues that surround them. It's a good choice for the character-driven half of the game, and a choice that hurts the mystery half. The catalyst of the plot occurs on Harfest, a kind of Halloween festival that the town puts on every year. After taking part in cheap play for children, May witnesses someone or something stealing a child away. May thinks it's a ghost, but no one believes her. The hunt for this so-called ghost is what begins Act 2. It's also right around this time that May begins having strange dreams, nightmares that take the form of platforming sections. They're also the weakest parts of the game. The first and last dream sequences are narratively important and mechanically sound, but everything in between is filler. It's the same thing over and over again. Jump around to find 4 musicians, which are always at the 4 corners of the level, then return to where you started. That's it. And you have to do it close to 5 times. The game is already repetitive, and this just makes the problem worse. These sequences could have been the showcase for the game's platforming, but that isn't the case. There are no hard jumps, and the only thing you'll ever lose in these sequences is time, not progress. Considering the budget the developers likely had to work with, this is a Kickstarter game after all, it's too much to ask that each dream sequence be completely unique with different areas and gameplay, but it would have been best if a few of them were cut out, or at least their size diminished. Act 2 is where the plot really begins. The large-scale vignettes, the ones where you hang out with either Greg or May's former best friend B, are pushed to the side in order to focus on ghost hunting vignettes. These are generally really good, and the game encourages replay value by only allowing you to do 2 of the 3 ghost hunts. It's here you begin learning discarded bits and pieces of the mystery hanging over Possum Springs. The questions begin to mount. The expectations for the climax climb. And in case you haven't noticed, these games aren't exactly great at ending. Still, Act 2 does contain one hangout vignette for Greg or B, the one you get depending on who you hung out with more during Act 1. These vignettes prove to be the character-driven climax for the game, the better climax for the game. And they're only that effective because the game has spent so long developing these characters over Act 1. Night in the Woods, character-wise, is a combination of Oxenfree and Life is Strange. It has a massive cast strewn around Possum Springs. However, within this is a close-knit personal ensemble that consists of May and her friends, and the game's 2 paths focus on 2 of them, Greg and B. Let's start with Greg. He's the first major character introduced in the game. He's May's best friend by default, and he's designed to be an appealing first choice for the player, the easy option, since on first glance, Greg is not only very open to you, but also very quirky. Some of the game's best laughs come from Greg and May's back-and-forth dialogue. Night in the Woods is a funny game. A lot of its dialogue is hilarious in a good way. It's a natural form of humor, the kind of half-formed semi-jokes and ironic sarcasm that me and my friends engage in all the time. The other games have their moments, but none of them had me laughing as consistently or as loudly as Night in the Woods. It's not a comedy game, though, because the humor is just one part of the writing. It's used to put the pathos of these characters into focus, like when Greg discusses his manic episodes and how they strain his relationships. It's effective. More effective than it would be in the other games, because you've gotten to understand Greg as a person through the kind of natural random humor real-life friends have. Night in the Woods is very good with dialogue, and this is especially noticeable because the game has no voice acting. It's just text. When trying to create natural-sounding modern dialogue, it's easy to let sentence structure and proper grammar ruin the naturalistic flow that kind of speaking has. Life is Strange had that problem, requiring the voice actors to pick up a lot of the slack to make it work. But not here. It may be all text, but it all sounds natural, and it never feels like the developers had to compromise basic writing rules in order to make it happen. Though they do seem to overuse May saying geez. Most of Greg's route plays similar to Life is Strange, where 2 people cut loose and indulge in some good old-fashioned criminal activity. Greg may now hold down a job at the Snack Falcon, and he may be in a dedicated relationship with his boyfriend Angus, but he's a hoodlum at heart, leather jacket and all. At least, that's what May thinks. May came home hoping everything would stay the same, that after 2 years away, Possum Springs would be frozen in a time bubble, that she could go back to the days of childhood where she didn't have to worry about her problems. This is shattered somewhat when May's favorite food place, Postabilities, goes out of business early in the game. But it appears that Greg hasn't changed, and that makes May happy. He has, though. He's more contemplative. The fact that he and Angus are the only gay people in town is starting to get to him. Not to mention that they're well aware that Possum Springs provides no opportunities. Greg may be Lord of the Snack Falcons, but he doesn't want to be Lord of the Snack Falcons forever. He wants better things. He's working with Angus to move to Bright Harbor, a much better town than Possum Springs. And May resists this. She wants Greg to stay, wants her version of normal to stay, even if it hurts Greg. Their crimes may seem like fun, but at the end of the day, May is pushing Greg into doing things he shouldn't be doing. He's come a long way, and May is dragging him back down. Greg is a good friend, and May is not. By the end of Greg's route, both parties realize this. Greg gets his life back on track, and finally says no to May. B's route is a thematic 180 from Greg's route. Greg's route starts out freewheeling and slowly, over time, gets more contemplative and serious as the consequences of crimes and Greg's manic behavior are explored. With B, it's all serious all the time, which is indicative of her personality. Everyone in Night in the Woods is sarcastic, but B's sarcasm is biting, at times even cruel. She doesn't like anyone, not even May. This is justified because B has lost her mother, basically lost her father, and has lost her future since she now has to spend all of her time running her father's hardware store. B has no patience for May's issues. Some of B's criticism isn't justified, but most of it is. May really only gets a partial understanding of how she screwed up in Greg's route. In B's route, it's much more pronounced. And as such, May starts changing as a person, along with B. B's route is the route I went with during my 2 playthroughs of Night in the Woods, and I'm glad I did, because the relationship with B and May is vivid and real, just as, if not more so, than Greg and May's relationship. The May and B relationship is also more complicated. It's a give and take. May brings some much-needed laughs and joy to B's life, but also a form of naivete. In B's final Act 1 hangout, May suggests that B just abandon her ungrateful, barely functional father due to his poor treatment of B, without any consideration for the real-world consequences B would face for doing so. May does have legitimate personal problems, but she's also really bad at understanding other people's problems and approaching them in the right way. This reaches a boiling point in B's final hangout, Proximity, which for me is a better ending than the actual third act of the game. B brings May to a party, similar to the one in Life is Strange, but more lively, with more things to do and some hidden content and dialogue. May, being the well-intentioned idiot she is, reveals to 2 college boys B is hitting on that B is from Possum Springs, and isn't going to college. B runs off embarrassed, and May runs after her in one of the few areas of the game that uses platforming to any kind of interesting effect. May meets B, looking over the river, and B admits that she hates May. She'll always hate May, at least in part. B has no future. It was taken away by crappy luck. Unlike Greg, she doesn't have anything to work for. She's trapped. May did get out. She went to college. She achieved B's dream. And to B, at least, May just threw it all away without a second thought. It's a moment that can end a friendship, but it doesn't. May just sits down next to B and points out that they need each other. They may not like it, but that's the truth. They're the best available friends, even if they would be totally incompatible in any other setting. Because proximity matters. It's a great ending to B's arc. The kind of self-contained, personal ending that Oxenfree tried and failed to do with its character. There are 2 other characters in the ensemble besides May, but they don't get nearly as much development as B or Greg. There's Angus, Greg's boyfriend, and Germ. He's just kind of there. Angus is a great foil for Greg and the rest of the cast. He's willing to joke around, but he's also quiet, and the closest the group has to a straight man besides B. He also has what may be the best ghost hunt sequence, which goes in depth on his backstory and his relationship with Greg. It also gives the main game a semi-meaningful tie-in to the supplementary game, Longest Night. It's not a huge thing, but it's a nice detail. Another nice detail is that Angus gets an entire new scene on this goat hunt if you complete an obscure side quest in the town where you mess with some mini windmills. It's not much, but it's more dialogue, and that's always a good thing in Night in the Woods. Germ is an enigma. You don't get to know much about him, especially if you're playing the vanilla game. But what's there makes a distinct impression. In a cast of weirdos, Germ is the weirdo of the group, and almost feels like he walked out of an entirely different game. He feels like he walked out of Life is Strange almost, although this time the odd dialogue is intentional. I wish Night in the Woods did more with him, but what you do get with Germ is pretty good. Finally, there's May, the main character. You've probably got a good idea of her already from Greg and B's paths. May is a lot like Chloe, or from a certain perspective, Delilah from Firewatch. She's not a good person. Far from it. She's selfish, a bit of a woman child that commits petty crimes for no reason. In those games, especially Life is Strange, this was mostly written off until about the end. However, it's clear from the start that not everything is right with May, that she's broken. This is what makes her compelling. You want her to succeed because she starts off in such a low, pathetic place that she can really only go up from there. In a recent interview with Game Informer, Scott Benson, one of the developers of the game, said, quote, "We're used to having characters in games who are better than us in every way. May isn't smarter than the player, and she isn't more emotionally proficient than the player. The only thing she's really good at is walking on phone wires. Otherwise, you as the player probably have your life together more than she does. I think that is way more interesting." End quote. May is also an example of mental illness portrayed well in a video game. Not in the crazy, stabby kind of way that Life is Strange did it with Nathan Prescott, but in a sad, understated way. May has, in the past, suffered from a dissociative episode and nearly killed a kid with a softball bat, something alluded to over the course of the game. She had another episode at college, seeing the world as just shapes. Meaningless, pointless shapes. That's the reason she came back. Because home, the home she remembers, is the only thing that feels real to her. Everything else is just shapes. This is a twist that comes late in the game, the kind that Firewatch sought to avoid. In Firewatch, the reasoning behind Henry going into the forest was so mundane that it didn't really have to have its own sections dedicated to it. Night in the Woods, however, might have benefited from this approach, since May's mental disorder goes a long way to explaining May's character. It also taught me that dissociative mental illnesses were a thing. Act 3 begins after the second ghost hunt, which itself happens after the final hangout, in my case, proximity. Act 3 of Night in the Woods shares a lot of its problems with Firewatch, and it is a weak ending. It's also better than Firewatch, for several reasons. There is no gradual shift from investigation to resolution. Like in Firewatch, it just kind of happens. May leads her friends into the woods after having some kind of vision. There, May and her friends walk in on some cultists in the wood, killing one of their own for leaving an arm out in the street. An arm you find on your first day in Possum Springs. As B and May will call them, they're a cult of conservative uncles, the kind of strawmen that blame all of America's problems on immigrants and hobos. The gang is discovered, and May nearly dies. But in truth, she's been dying for a while now. Ever since the dream started, she's been having constant headaches. She's been tired all the time, feeling sick, looking sicker. A long fall off the side of a cliff doesn't make May feel any worse than she already did. And that's really saying something. After the conversation where May reveals her disassociation to B or Greg, depending on which route you take, May returns to the mine, alone, ready to die. The only thing that saves her is the arrival of her friends. It's cliché, yes, but also effective. May is at her lowest point, lower than when she first came home, and yet her friends refuse to abandon her or give up on her. May is messed up, but there is a good person deep down worth saving. They enter the mine, and the cultists explain everything in a scene reminiscent of Mr. Jefferson's long speech or the ghosts from Oxenfree's final conversation. Possum Springs is a hole, and there's a literal hole at the center of it, in the mines. There's something under the hole, a being fans of the game call the Black Goat. It's an eldritch being, and it's hungry. When it's hungry, it sings to the cult, and if the cult is to be believed, it sings to May too. It's the source of her nightmares. The cult feeds the Black Goat's sacrifices. People the town won't miss, like May's old friend Casey. And in return, the Black Goat saves Possum Springs from economic disaster. If it isn't fed, a literal disaster befalls the town. The same kind of disaster that the game describes in an opening sequence similar to Firewatch. The only reason you're not dead now is because the cult is getting old, and it wants May and her friends to take their place. They don't have much time to think about the offer, though, because one of the cultists, the one May saw in Harfest, tries to kill May. He dies when Angus drops an elevator on him, and the rest of the cultists presumably die when the cave collapses. This isn't so much a tonal shift as a tonal reveal, because there never was a mystery in Night in the Woods. Night in the Woods is a cosmic horror story, a classical one, the kind of story H.P. Lovecraft used to write. The pieces are all there. A decaying small town, filled with people who have been touched by the evil in some way or another, a young, insecure protagonist, an impossibly powerful, uncaring force that drives anyone who gets close to it insane and renders them physically ill. Night in the Woods isn't so much creating something new as it is shining a light on what was already there. The epilogue even references this, with May finding a book called The Shapes from Outer Space. which sounds very similar to the classic Lovecraft story The Color Out of Space, which, like Night in the Woods, focuses on an alien being taking residence in a hole and destroying the lives of those around it. The cosmic horror stuff is great. It's over far too quickly. The cult, despite how important they are barely a footnote in the grand scheme of the game. They show up out of nowhere, with little to no setup, give you their backstory and motives, and then just as quickly, they're gone, and with them, any answers to the questions May and the player may have. It's even unclear whether or not what's happening is truly supernatural. It could be that the dreams are a result of May's mental illness, and the cult's beliefs a result of hallucinogenic mind gas, something mentioned in an optional newspaper clipping you can find in the library. You don't know, and the game is very uninterested in telling you. Just like Firewatch and Life is Strange. Unlike those games, though, which end almost immediately after their unsatisfying twists, Night in the Woods keeps going. It has an actual epilogue, and it's a great one. Every single side plot in the game, all of them, get resolved in some way during the epilogue. Even the otherwise inconsequential Dusk Star and Rat side quests amount to something in the end. Then there's the final conversation, where the characters, much like in Life is Strange, admit that they may never know the truth about what the heck was actually going on. That's okay, though, because they have today, and that will have to be enough. Roll credits. Yeah, it's not the game's A material, but it has a denouncement, and anything besides the cult in the game's supernatural elements is satisfactorily resolved. It's not a perfect ending, but it's not a bad one either. Like Oxenfree, Night in the Woods has some post-release content added to it. Most of it isn't worth mentioning, but what's added are nice additions, and I'm glad they were included. The best part of the Weird Autumn Edition, as it's called, is the addition of more scenes featuring Germ, where you learn about his family. It's not much more Germ, but it is more Germ, and I'm perfectly okay with more Germ. Night in the Woods may be overall a rather repetitive game, and a rather unfocused game, and a game with a weak ending. But when the game is over, you're not going to remember any of that. You're going to remember Greg, and Bee, and Angus, and maybe even Germ. You're going to remember Possum Springs as a place. You're going to remember the people within it. And you're going to remember all of its problems. Night in the Woods may not be the best game ever made, but it's an important game. It's one of the best games released in 2017, and it's hard to go back to something as comparatively simplistic as a Telltale game after Night in the Woods. I'll be playing Night in the Woods for years to come. I think most people will be too. I know I've been hard on these games, Firewatch and Life is Strange especially, but they're all good games, and they're all worth playing, and I hope you give them a try. Just wait for Firewatch to go on sale first. Wowee! That was long, but we finally got through it. I hope you liked this. It took me like a week to play through all these games and then write down what I liked about them. Maybe I'll do another video like this. Maybe I won't. I don't know. Still, it was fun, and I want to thank you for watching. Later.